He killed a man in front of hundreds of people, not in a war, not in a fight, not out of anger. He did it because the town paid him to. The man was kneeling. The crowd was watching. The sword was sharp, and still, his hands shook. He was not nervous because of the man about to die. He was nervous because of the people watching. If the blade slipped, if the head did not come off cleanly, they would blame him. They always did. He was the executioner. This was his job. Before we continue, subscribe if you want to uncover more forgotten history like this one. We tell the stories no one else wants to remember. And tell us in the comments which part of brutal history we should uncover next. Your thoughts help us decide what to explore next. He did not choose the job. He was born into it. His father had been the town's executioner before him. His grandfather was before that. Once your family carried the blood, there was no escape. No one else would take the job. And so he had to do it, every time, without mistake, without hesitation, without a soul. This was not just violence, it was theater. And he was both the actor and the target. Because when the show ended, no one thanked him. No one looked him in the eye. He was the man who ended lives for a living, and could never have one of his own. No child dreamed of becoming an executioner. In medieval Europe, it was not a career you chose. It was a role you inherited. In many cities, the job passed through generations. Once your family took it on, there was no escape. Executioners were seen as unclean, not physically dirty but spiritually contaminated. Because they spilled human blood, people believed their souls were permanently stained. And yet, someone had to do the killing. Every town needed punishment. Thieves, heretics, murderers, all had to be dealt with, and not quietly. These punishments had to be made public, justice needed to be seen. But no one wanted to swing the blade. When a man became an executioner, whether by bloodline, by punishment, or desperation, his entire family bore the weight. Their wives were labeled as wives of the damned. Their children were shunned. Their homes were marked. Many towns even forced executioner families to live outside the town walls. In the Holy Roman Empire, once someone became an executioner, their children would inherit the job, not by law, but because stigma sealed their fate. No one would marry them. No one would hire them. Their family name was enough to lock them in place. In Germany, some cities gave condemned criminals a choice: die or become the town executioner. Survival meant taking lives repeatedly for the rest of your own. In France, executioners were called bourreaux. They were avoided in markets. Priests refused to bless them. Even churches that endorsed executions often treated the executioners themselves as sinful. And yet they could not be replaced. That was the curse. Once you took the job, you could not walk away. In many towns, the executioner also dug graves, removed bodies, handled suicides, and cleared waste. Anything too dirty for the average citizen became his responsibility. The town gave him work, but he is never welcomed. The role was not just marked by blood, it was marked by isolation. The executioner's job was not simple. He did not just kill, he tortured, he mutilated, he staged death. His work was the foundation of medieval justice, a system built on pain, performance, and fear. Sword was mostly used for nobility. The executioner's sword was long, double-handed, and specifically crafted for beheading. Beheading by sword was considered a more honorable death, fast and clean. But it demanded skill. A single accurate stroke was expected. If the blade struck wrong or the executioner hesitated, the victim suffered, and the crowd might riot. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was poorly executed. Axe struck her head, then her shoulder, and only removed her head after 3 attempts. The executioner was never forgiven. After that, the axe was more commonly used for the lower classes. It is heavier, cruder, less precise. Errors were more frequent and far more gruesome. Hanging was considered typical punishment for thieves and common criminals, but even here, precision was required. The executioner had to measure the drop based on the victim's height and weight. If the rope is too short, the condemned strangled slowly, too long, and the neck might be torn off. The goal was a clean neck break, immediate death, but it was rarely guaranteed. Sometimes torture came before death. It was used to extract confessions, force to reveal names, or punish rebellion. The most common devices included the rack, a wooden frame with rollers at both ends. The victim's hands and feet were tied, and the rollers pulled slowly to stretch the body, often to the point of joint dislocation. The iron boot, a metal casing placed around the leg. Wedges were hammered into it to crush the bones. Thumb screws, a simple vice device used to crush the fingers or thumbs between metal plates. Red-hot tongs, used to tear flesh, often after heating the metal over a fire. The breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel. This was one of the most feared methods. The condemned person's limbs were shattered with a hammer, then tied to a large wagon wheel, where they were left to die slowly. All of these happened in public. Torture could last for hours or days. The executioner was responsible for each step, not just inflicting pain, but ensuring the process matched legal guidelines. Execution was not private. It was a public event, and the executioner had to perform. Towns announced executions days in advance. Crowds gathered, vendors sold food, children watched. Justice had to be loud and visible to work. It was both entertainment and warning. The executioner sometimes wore a hood, not for secrecy but to create a sense of fear. But in many towns everyone knew his face. That made him both feared and familiar, and his very face became a symbol of death. If the job was done cleanly, the crowd might cheer. If not, the crowd might turn violent. In some towns, the executioner was forced to hold up the severed head and shout the name of the condemned. In some regions, heads were boiled and placed on spikes as warnings. He could not refuse. The court demanded the act. The people demanded the show. No one protected him from either. He lived inside the town, but never became part of it. People avoided him. Vendors refused to serve him. Children were told not to look at him. He could not hold office. He could not testify in court. In many places, he was not even allowed to enter a church. His house was placed outside the city walls, not for his safety, but to keep the town clean. People believed that his presence could bring misfortune or spiritual contamination. His family carried the same burden. Daughters rarely married. Sons had no future. Even if a son wanted to become a farmer or a merchant, no one would hire them. The family name alone was enough to shut every door. Sometimes the only people they could marry were other social outcasts, children of tanners, grave diggers, or prostitutes. These unions were not built on choice. They were a way to survive. Priests often refused to visit their homes. When someone in the family died, they were buried outside the churchyard. That kind of burial was usually reserved for heretics or the unbaptized. Even when an executioner did his job well, it changed nothing. He might be respected for his precision. He might be praised for his consistency, but he was never accepted. One of the most documented cases is Franz Schmidt, who worked as an executioner in Nuremberg in the late 1500s. He performed over 300 executions and kept detailed records of each one of it. His notes were clinical, orderly, and professional. He took his work extremely seriously. And still, his children were banned from entering many trades. His family name kept them out of guilds. Their neighbors refused to do business with them. Later in life, Schmidt petitioned the government to clear the stain from his family's name, not through church absolution, but through official paperwork. He wanted his children to live normal lives. His request was granted, but it took him decades. Most executioners never had that chance. There was no petition, no mercy, no way out. When they died, their names were forgotten. Some were buried in unmarked graves. Others were tossed into the same pits as the criminals they executed. The town needed their service, but never their presence. They were erased from the living, and then from history. Killing became routine, but the body does not forget, and neither does the mind. Some executioners trained themselves to disconnect emotionally. They treated the condemned like a task to complete, something to measure and manage, nothing more. It was not personal, it was duty. But detachment is not the same as peace. Over time, many executioners showed signs of psychological damage. Many turned to alcohol. Some became reclusive. Some reported hearing the voices of the people they had killed. A few broke down mid-task in front of the crowds, weeping, shaking, unable to continue. And when they broke, there was no sympathy. The town expected composure. If an executioner showed weakness, people did not see a man in pain. They saw failure. To survive, some developed rituals to cope, sharpening the blade in silence, wearing the same gloves, focusing only on steps and timing. Others became obsessed with control, watching every movement of the condemned, every breath, blink and voice, anticipate for panic and collapse. But none of that helped during torture. Executions were brief, but torture was different. Torture could last for hours, sometimes days. The screams were part of the job. So were the bones breaking, the skin tearing, the begging, and the executioner had to carry it out. Confessions were extracted through pain. Screams were expected. Blood was routine. Some begged for mercy. Some confessed quickly. But if the court ordered a full sentence, the pain continued, whether the executioner wanted it or not. In some cities, executioners were paid by the session. Longer torture meant more pay. Some refused to exploit it, others leaned into it, and over time, it was no longer clear who they were anymore. A servant of the law, or something else. Records from Germany and France mention executioners who had become hardened. That meant emotionally dead. One was reported laughing during torture. Another executioner began drawing images of what he had done. These were not evil men. These were not just killers. They were tools of a system, forced to kill, to break, to instill pain, and still wake up the next day and do it again. They could not confess. They could not enter churches. No priest would hear them. So when they suffered in silence. And when they finally lost control, no one helped them. Because a broken executioner was not seen as a victim. He was seen as dangerous. Most executioners never retired. Even if they survived into old age, there was nowhere else to go. No one hired them. No town welcomed them. No priest buried them. So the job stayed in the family. In many regions, especially in Germany, Switzerland, and parts of France, entire dynasties of executioners emerged. Fathers trained sons. They taught the knowledge of where to strike and how hard. They taught the knowledge of tortures. They passed down their tools like heirlooms. They passed down the same sword, the same gloves, the same leather coat. They also passed down the curse. Children born to executioners were marked from birth. Even if they wanted nothing to do with the work, the town would not let them forget. Schools shut them out. Trades refused them. Their family name was a sentence. And so, generation after generation, the curse continued. In some cases, executioners tried to escape. They moved to another town. They lied about their past. They changed everything they could, but eventually someone would recognize them, and their past followed. Others chose to stay, and made a life within the curse. A few became highly respected, not as people, but as professionals. And yet, no matter how skilled they were, they remained separate, useful, but not welcome. One of the most well-documented executioners in European history was Franz Schmidt, who served in Nuremberg in the late 1500s. He kept a journal for over 40 years, recording 361 executions and 345 other punishments. His notes were exact, clear, methodical, and almost clinical. He listed names, dates, crimes, and final words. But they were not cold. He described the condemned, how they cried, begged, or cursed. He recorded the condemned mistakes. He even described the crowd's reaction, and between the lines, you can see a man trying to stay human, trying not to lose himself in the repeated killing. And still, his children faced rejection. Late in life, Schmidt petitioned the city to lift the stain from his family. He wanted his children to have a future beyond the axe. The request was granted, but only after decades of bloodshed. When Schmidt died, he was one of the few executioners to be granted a proper burial. Most executioners never received that chance. They were buried without markers, or tossed into the same pits as the criminals they killed. Their homes were left to rot. Their tools were sold off or inherited by the next man in line. And just like that, a new name was bound to the job. That was the final weight of the curse. not just being forced to kill, not just being hated for it, but being needed so deeply by the world, and yet never allowed to be part of it.